Welcome back to Radio Rothbard. I'm Ryan McMakin, executive editor at the Mises Institute. And today we're going to talk about international organizations. And these are organizations like the EU, like the World Trade Organization. You could point to any number of these that currently exist. You might even say NATO, for example, and maybe even the International Criminal Court. And the question is from our perspective, that is the perspective of freedom and free markets, radical decentralization, minimizing state power, are these good organizations? Do they actually help in the maintenance of freedom and the restraint of state power? So we'll discuss this a little bit with our guest, Joseph Solis-Mullen. And we've had Joseph on Radio Rothbard before. He is one of our few political scientists that we can go to for these sorts of topics. And just so you know a little bit about Joseph, he's the author of 2 books, The Fake China Threat and Its Very Real Danger. We've reviewed that at Mises.org. And he has a new book published by the Libertarian Institute called The National Debt and You. And he is a political scientist, economist, and Ralph Raico Fellow at the Libertarian Institute. He's a graduate of Spring Arbor University, the University of Illinois, and the University of Missouri. And, of course, his work can be found at Mises.org. He's published in the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics. He also writes regularly for the Libertarian Institute and has written for the Journal of Libertarian Studies, among other publications. He teaches currently history and political science at Spring Arbor University. So, Joseph, welcome. Thanks for coming on the show. I hope you're well. And I want to discuss one of your articles that pertains to this topic. You had an article a couple of weeks ago on Mises.org called "We Can't Fix International Organizations Like the WTO, Abolish Them." Now, that is a title I wrote for you for that article. You may have have felt that there was a better explanation of this article for purposes of the title, but nonetheless, I liked it, and we published it, and it's based on an article by a person named Marcos Falcone. And Falcone has actually written a couple of articles for Mises.org as well. And his article, which is an academic article, it is titled Subsidiarity and Secession, Bringing the Austrian School to the 21st Century. And this is, although it doesn't mention it in the title, this is largely about international institutions like the WTO, like the EU, like these sorts of organizations that we often hear about, the United Nations, for example, where he looks at the work of Mises, Hayek, and Rothbard and tries to fit the topic of international institutions and organizations into their thinking. So you published a critique on this, and rather than just keep talking, rather than me just talking, why don't we have you kind of provide just the general framework for these 2 articles? And so really my question is for you, what are these organizations? And what is the rationale given for them? Maybe even like a brief history of when these modern international organizations started to come into being, because they're in the background there for lots of people, and people know sort of vaguely about them. But why do we have them? And why are we told they are necessary and good?
Well, Ryan, thank you for the introduction. Thank you for having me on again. It's always such a pleasure to chat with you. So I suppose the first thing that I would say is, I often receive publications, and I always have alerts set for various topics that things get published on, and this came on my radar. I got a review copy, and I immediately knew that I was going to have a problem with the article. Anytime you have someone trying to group Hayek in with Mises, and especially with Rothbard, I know there's going to be some inconsistency there, simply because the first Austrian I started reading was actually Hayek, which I don't think is unusual for someone coming from like mainstream academia. And as soon as I started reading Mises and then reading Rothbard, I was like, this is like people who say that Mises was a neoliberal and Hillary Clinton was a neoliberal. Clearly, this term doesn't mean anything if we're grouping these people in the same camp. And especially when it comes to things like international organizations, I just think Hayek diverges sharply. He was a big believer in things like interstate federalism, and that is the perspective with which Falcone is clearly approaching the article. And he brings in Rothbard to kind of accentuate minor points of the argument, when, in my opinion, it's I'm not trying to be uncharitable when I say this, but I think it's a little bit disingenuous to bring Rothbard in on the side of arguments that clearly he would not have supported on the basis of minor areas where he might have supported it. And so what I wrote was a critique of the article. I always try and do these things respectfully, steelman, not trying to strawman the argument or anything like that. It seemed to me that, look, if your argument is that international organizations are good and effective, which he does argue, he makes all sorts of arguments about how these things have improved life on Earth, and you want to argue that you could improve them by allowing them to have more subsidiarity and things of that nature, okay, fine. That can be an argument, but I don't think it's proper, it's good scholarship to bring in an author who would disagree with that premise entirely to augment one or two minor points there. And so that's what I did. Some of the organizations that he is really interested in are things like the WTO, the World Trade Organization. Now, this grew out of the General Agreement on Tariffs, which was created in 1948, and in 1995, it was reborn as the WTO. Now, the idea of the World Trade Organization, just like the GATT before it, was to create an arena wherein there could be a large degree of cooperation between states to quote unquote facilitate trade. To make more trade happen. Of course, the problem with the GATT and the problem with the World Trade Organization is the same problem that you have with all so-called free trade organizations. Because, Ryan, you know that from our perspective, an actual free trade agreement could be written on the back of a bar napkin. It would say no tariffs, no quotas, no subsidies, no labor regulations, sign here. And that would be a free trade. That would be a free trade agreement. The fact that these things run hundreds and thousands of pages tells you that, in fact, these are not free trade organizations. There are all sorts of carve-outs. The EU is a wonderful example, of course, because to get the French to go along, what did they have to do? They had to provide those nice subsidies for the farmers, right? Like in all states, you can't alienate the farmers. They're too important a voting bloc. And so I think that it's a misnomer to talk about these things as facilitating free trade, being an underpinning of free trade. It is government managed trade. And to say that, well, look, since we had these organizations, look at this correlation. We've had more trade since we had these things, more globalization. Look, number one, we would have to run some regression analysis to see how much of that could even be theoretically ascribed to that. But I think it's much more important that we had phenomenal private sector innovations in things like container shipping, things like automation of ports. These are things that I think probably explain much more than the fact that for 60 years global leaders would get together and have a talking shop, because that's really what the GATT was. And there's all sorts of carve-outs and exceptions and things. It's one of the reasons multilateral deals in general just aren't a good idea. Even if you aren't a libertarian, it's trying to make a one-size-fits-all system, which necessarily implies making all sorts of little carve-outs and exceptions, and it just turns into a labyrinthine system. Even if you are someone who's a statist, like, you should clearly prefer bilateral agreements as opposed to multilateral agreements that are upheld by these massive international organizations.
Now, what about organizations, though, that are said to preserve peace? Like there's some discussion in here in the League of Nations and, say, the UN, and we might even say maybe the EU. Is in helping keep peace, right? Because part of the rationale was that, this will help increase integration between the Germans and the French and prevent another continental war in Europe. And so what should we say to that when somebody's saying, hey, look, since we created all these international organizations after 1945, there hasn't been a general war in Europe, so I guess mission accomplished, so I guess all these things are necessarily good.
Well, I think you could make an even stronger case that in the era prior to the 20th century, prior to the efforts of the League of Nations and stuff, you had even less global conflict than you did today. If we take a look at the world since 1914, there's scarcely been a year without war, especially if you look at the years since 1945. And the fact that the Germans and the French bled each other white twice in 30 years and are now just sick of war, and you talk to them, it's not the same kind of culture that it was. No, I don't think that's anything to say to the credit of something like the UN, which has essentially served as a rubber stamp for interventions that Washington and its quote-unquote coalition of the willing have decided to enact all over the world. So I don't think there's actually a good book over here called was it Cold War Killing Fields, that basically tackles this idea put forth by scholars like John Lewis Gaddis, who say the long peace. Look at what these great international organizations and Pax Americana have done for the world. No, there's been killing all over the place. Not a year has gone by where there hasn't been some kind of horrifying conflict going on everywhere. So I don't think it's true that they have made conflict less likely. I think the thing that made conflict less likely in the case of Europe is that Germany was occupied and disarmed by the United States, and then they effectively outsourced their security to the United States to be able to afford their very lavish welfare states. And there's all sorts of good literature on this, and it's one of the reasons that the discussions that are happening now are so interesting is because they have no effective way of defending themselves in the event that there was some kind of, which I don't think there would be any kind of conflict, but they basically outsourced their foreign policy to the United States. They took security off the menu of things they were going to fight about and just let America deal with it. And that's created all sorts of additional problems. So, no, I don't think that, certainly not NATO. The UN, no. I mean, the UN has no enforcement mechanisms, and it's not really a participatory democratic body. It is an elitist body. Like the general body can make all the votes it wants. It's the Security Council that makes all the decisions. So it's an elitist organization in the high. Even if you're a statist, it's an organization for the elitists of the statists. Like it's there's nothing to it. The League of Nations, of course, is even more transparently so.
Well, I guess there's a couple of things we could say, right? We could just note that, look at NATO's record, right, and just blindly supporting the U.S. in pointless wars like in Libya and against Serbia and that sort of thing. So, I mean, it's just NATO's record is not exactly a record of peace. They'll pick on any sort of small country that they can get away with picking on. But your topic, your comment about how it serves the elites, I think really takes us to a big critique that Rothbard often pointed to. And I think that was a good time to just ask you kind of in general, what was Rothbard's critique of these organizations? Because as he noted, right, these organizations, they're playgrounds for the people at the very top of the member states. They hardly have any relationship at all to the markets, to the private sector within each member state. So what was Rothbard's overall problem with these international organizations?
Well, I'm sure your listeners are familiar with Rothbardian class theory, which I think is one of the most useful analytical sociological lenses anyone could apply to the world today. Because it isn't that there aren't different groups in conflict. It's just that it's not conflict of the kind that Marx and the classical Marxists described. It is as Rothbard described. It is the producing class who is involved in voluntary exchange and free interaction, and then the statists who acquire their gains through political power and through extracting, often non-voluntarily, from the population. And when you look at international organizations, it's that on steroids. I mean, so for Rothbard, obviously, these should be eliminated entirely. They're totally unnatural constructs that exist solely to serve political elites, and this includes people like commercial, corporatist elites, because of course there's a real conjunction between the corporate cronyism that we have that is sold to us as, oh my gosh, our capitalism is so out of control, free market capitalism is run amok. No, we have a corporatist state, of course, and the intersection there is that you have corporate elites working in close conjunction with technocrats and elected officials in the government to carve out deals and arrangements for themselves that benefit themselves at the expense of the rest of us. And I've written several articles about, for example, the the trading of the industrial base to support militarist expansion abroad in places like East Asia. So it's perfectly clear that Rothbard is correct in pointing out that these are extractive institutions that serve political elites, certainly don't serve individuals of the individual countries there. So that's what I think Rothbard would say about these, specifically in nations by consent.
Now, something I think I would mention about Rothbard is, of course, he made distinctions among states in the sense that some were worse than others, right? And we can see this a lot, I think, in his discussions of, say, the so-called United States under the Articles of Confederation versus the United States under the later Constitution of 1788, right? Which he clearly did not like, the new Constitution, very much against that. And he was much more in favor of the earlier 1776, 1777 Constitution, which we now call the Articles of Confederation. And this brings us to some of the issues discussed by Falcone in the article, right? Is that there was such a low level of centralization of power under that system. There was it was very easy to basically veto the actions of the central state in that system. And there was a high level of consensus required in that system, totally in contrast to the later Constitution, which basically gave to bare majorities in Congress and in other institutions all of this governing power, and made it much more difficult for a small minority to veto the possibility of some sort of centralized initiative. And Falcone seems to take this into effect, or it provides something of a discussion about this in part of his article where he talks about Switzerland a lot and posits Switzerland as a better model for decentralization than, of course, a standard centralized unitary state, and perhaps even many other federal type states. But I mean, ultimately, right, Rothbard was recognizing that, okay, the member states, even in the U.S. under the original Constitution, and even the states, quote unquote, that is the cantons in the Swiss system, these were still, of course, monopoly governments to an extent. And so if we're going to talk about improving these organizations, right, wouldn't there be strategies? Whereas even if they remained illegitimate, if given the option to improve them for a variety of ways, could not we do that? Say, making it extremely easy to secede from these organizations, right? Like it was possible to secede from the EU, still is, technically. But boy, as we found when Britain was talking about seceding from the EU, they pulled out all the stops to discourage the Brits from doing that, and of course waged a propaganda campaign against the British. And then after the British seceded, have done a lot to try and isolate Britain economically and such. So couldn't you maybe provide some improvement on these organizations by simply making it harder for them to engage in any sort of centralized action? Or, I mean, what sort of strategies could be used to make these organizations less bad?
Well, okay, I think there are two things here. Of course, it's a relative question in terms of actual practice. My issue with the article is that it is presenting this project of creating better international institutions as the project for the Austrian school in the 21st century. I'm sorry, that's not the project I want to be a part of in the 21st century. Improving the workings of international organizations, of course they would be less objectionable. As you said, it was less objectionable than this. We can, of course, look around and evaluate the relative standings of different states. Of course, I would rather live in a state that didn't have any income tax, or something like that. But really, what we want to work towards is a totally privatized society, an anarcho-capitalist society. And these governmental organizations just don't have any place there, because government doesn't have any place there. And so ipso facto, there is no place for them there. So yes, of course, Falcone is right that yes, this system is a little better than this system. And yes, if you allowed secession, made it easier and stuff. In point of actual practice, though, if we're taking our realist glasses and just looking at it, as you said, It was extremely difficult for Britain to do it, and the only reason David Cameron did it was to fight off a political threat from his right. He never thought that it was going to happen. He simply did it because he promised on the campaign trail to shore up support on his right to do it. If you had told him, this is actually, the people are actually going to vote to leave, he would not have done it. He wouldn't have done it. He would have just tried to fight through it. He was not a supporter of Brexit, never was. And as you said, there was a huge propaganda campaign, and there is nothing more permanent than a government program, than a temporary government program, right? Once you get into an organization like this, once you create a government program, you immediately create a set of strategically placed interests who will do anything to fight to preserve the benefits that they derive from membership in that organization or from the existence of that government program. It's a very standard problem in economics. It is diffuse costs, highly concentrated benefits. And we know that it's impossible to get rid of these things. Look at what's going on right now with the Department of Government Efficiency, trying to make the most minor of cuts, right? And they're just fighting tooth and nail for it. These are sinecures. You know, we don't talk about them that way. We look at old regimes and say, oh, well, of course, these were non-productive jobs, sinecures, we call them. We have those now. The state will always create these parasites. So no, I fundamentally disagree with the idea that because you can say this state is relatively better than this other state, and that if an international organization made secession or subsidiarity easier, in theory, that we should work towards that and improve that. I just disagree. That might be the project of some other groups, but in terms of the Austrian school, I think our goal should be the anarcho-capitalist vision of society and working towards that.
Well, and it seems a problem with forming these sorts of organizations always seems to be that they drift toward centralization virtually all of the time. This is obviously true in the case of the United States. It's true in the case of Switzerland. If you look at where Switzerland was just 50 years ago in terms of its centralization in its federal government, it's gone much more in that direction, even though it remains relatively, probably the most decentralized state in the world to this day, certainly more decentralized than the United States. But the drift always is in favor of more centralization, in spite of all the talk about subsidiarity. And this is kind of one of my problems with the invocation of the word subsidiarity is, and I discussed this in the introduction to my book on secession called Breaking Away, which you can buy on Mises.org, or you can buy it on Amazon, or you can read it for free on Amazon. And so in Breaking Away, in the intro, I note that I'm not going to be using the word subsidiarity a lot in the book. Because a question I often got was, if people found out I was writing a book on secession, they say, oh, so you're going to talk about subsidiarity. And as the more I looked at subsidiarity, I saw that it was a real ineffective concept in terms of maintaining decentralization. And the idea here is this. The problem is this, is that subsidiarity is this idea that, okay, well, the functions of government should be kept to the most local, i.e. lowest level possible, or that is practical. It's the lowest level, the most local level that is practical, that can be done. Note those weasel words at the end. It's the lowest level possible. It's the lowest level that's practical. Okay, well, how do we define possible and practical? What I find happens virtually all the time with these organizations is we start defining as impractical doing a variety of government functions at the most local level. And so what happens is that what is possible, what is practical, keeps getting defined up to a higher and higher level of government. And you can see this even today, right? Talk to people on the American left and say, hey, we should decentralize the welfare state. Right? There should be no national Social Security. There should be no national Medicare. A state like Florida, which has 25 million people and is thus larger than most European countries, could certainly have its own welfare state with no need for a welfare state from the federal government. You suggest that to someone on the left and they say, no, that could never work. That's impossible. That can't work. Well, why not? Oh, because it's much more practical to do at the federal level because of economies of scale, because it reduces the per person administration costs, et cetera, et cetera. So then they're suddenly telling you that no, you can't have a decentralized federal wealth, you can't have a decentralized welfare state because it's not possible because of the XYZ. It's not practical because of ABC. So you can see how subsidiarity can easily be massaged, can easily be manipulated to define that the practical level of administration is always at the top. It's always at some higher level. And of course, obviously, you can't suggest to someone that you have a county level federal or a county level welfare state, right? Why don't we just have it at this metro area level? Why don't we have a metro state, an old age pension? They'll explain to you why that's not practical, why that's not possible. People might move away. It's not practical. So subsidiarity, everywhere I look at it, just ends up saying that, yeah, have the higher level of government do all of these things because it's just not practical for the lower level to do it. So I'm unimpressed when people start whipping around the word subsidiarity because in the end, these people end up arguing for some sort of centralization. And so I just find the whole invocation of the term to leave me feeling flat and unimpressed. And because that seems to be the factor everywhere, that everywhere there's this drift toward centralized government. We see that in America, we see it in Europe, we see it with the EU, which is, of course, far more powerful than it was. Every few years, the EU comes back with this new round of treaties that the people are supposed to vote on that gives more and more centralized power to the EU. Unless you have institutions in place that really, really provide easy vetoes or secession, it just doesn't seem to work. So I then want to get to then what is the possible solution for this sort of thing, Joseph, right? We're talking about, can there be large global organizations of any kind, right, that foster cooperation, not necessarily among nation states, but what about cooperation among people from a variety of nations, of people from around the world? Do we have historical examples of this? Do we have institutions that can really pave the way for lack of a better term, international cooperation the world over, or are we stuck with these organizations that are really just clubs of sovereign states?
Well, since in my view most people are statists, I think we are probably stuck with it. I think if anything, things will probably get worse. As you said, the unfortunate tendency, no matter how well designed a decentralized system is, the tendency is for power to increasingly centralize itself. There's a book behind me on the shelf here by Robert Higgs where he documents the ratchet effect. And if your readers haven't read Crisis in Leviathan, they definitely should, where he talks about critical episodes in the growth of government. And that is what happens over time. It happens in virtually all states. And as they get larger, they get less efficient, et cetera, et cetera. Look, of course we can have voluntary organizations with global reach, with people of all nationalities, any collectivist label you want, any individual. The Catholic Church, for example. Numbers of church groups, they have no coercive power to extract wealth from you or make you do things. The problem with governments is that if you disagree, respectfully I disagree, in the words of Bartleby the Scrivener, I would prefer not to, they will send men with guns to make you. April 15th is coming up, so I hope you've all filled out your taxes, right? These are not your voluntary contributions for living in a civilized society so that we have roads and stuff. This is the bill you pay not to be in jail. So, no, I completely reject the premise that these organizations are good for us, that they're necessary for the betterment of human society, that they are instruments of anything other than elite extraction and control. And, I wish people like Marcus, no ill will. Marcos Falcone, I wish him no ill will. We simply completely disagree. We completely disagree. I think your point on the tendency of organizations to continue to centralize is absolutely correct. When you look at the EU, that was always the goal. If you look at the discussions that were had, which of course weren't public at the time, but it's been 30 years, we can see the papers of the people who wrote the Maastricht Treaty now. The idea was economic union first, political union will follow. That we'll be able to build up these networks and then use successive waves of crisis to centralize power and create an actual centralized United States, like post-1860s United States of Europe. And that is exactly the project that is happening, and they are using the power of the central bank to do it. You look at people like Maloney, who acted like she wasn't going to play ball. They just dangled the money bag. Now she's on board. People who they don't think they can get to play ball, like the AfD or Marine Le Pen, they'll simply make them unconstitutional, declare them illegal, lock them up. And I mean, the state plays for keeps. The establishment is not playing around. We saw how they tried to frame Donald Trump for treason, to rein him in, right? This is not a voluntary, peaceable group of people who just are looking out for the best interests of society or something like that. The state needs to be abolished, and certainly any international institution that is a club of states for their elites to more easily extract revenues from us should be abolished as well.
Well, and of course you can see that too in how they treat, say, Hungary and Poland, right?
Yeah.
Where, well, and that shows also the way they dangle the money bags to keep these organizations within the EU or other related international organizations. Is there are big wealth transfers going on from the rich countries to the poorer countries in the EU, and this is, of course, framed as its international development fund and so on. But, of course, it translates into political power where, hey, look, Poland and Hungary, if you don't play ball, if you don't allow immense numbers of immigrants in, or you don't get rid of these politicians who do things we don't like, we're going to take away the money bags. And that continues to keep these nation states closely connected then to the central power in Brussels, and it's very well done. It's not even subtle. It's just a very strong type of manipulation where we pay you off to keep you inside. Now, of course, states have used this for years and years, right? The powerful metropolitan center subsidizes areas of each country that are perhaps less culturally and politically attached to the center. It's a very useful tactic. It's been used for about 500 years, if not more. And I think we're seeing that very much in the way that these international organizations develop. They develop like a lot of other organizations that were originally not states, but over time congealed as states. And perhaps that is the primary threat then of these international organizations, is just their tendency toward building up new, larger mega states where a multitude of states used to exist. And this is a point Rothbard made, of course, and a point that I make in Breaking Away is, and really which Falcone makes in the article, because I would say that 80% of the article is largely summaries of the thinking of Hayek and Mises and Rothbard, and just provide in those summaries a lot of interesting information about what these three thinkers were saying. And the point being, and this is actually true for not even libertarian authors, right, is the admission that a large number of nation states actually provides competition that restrains the states. Because you can always exit and go to a state that's less despotic, less awful. And as long as that exists, as long as there's a multitude of states that provide that sort of choice, that reins in state power. But the opposite of that then is to take all the independent states of Europe and turn it into one megastate, and then you're getting rid of all of that choice that people used to have. And that seems to be the goal that is going on right now, as they try to make uniform all of this bureaucratic policy, and even putting together a military power now for the megastate, the United States of Europe, that they seem to want. So that, I mean, as I look at that as someone who wants freedom and free markets, that just continues to be a huge threat. It would seem then that the counter to all this is really the vision of perhaps Richard Cobden, and his view, right, was that we don't need organizations of states. What we need is more international cooperation through markets. And this was, of course, revolutionary thinking, really, in Europe in the 19th century. And Cobden's, this is all covered by Ralph Raico in his history of political thought called The Struggle for Liberty. And he talks about how Cobden was called the international man. And because Cobden really hammered together a long, peaceful period between the UK and France through peace agreements, really encouraged a lot of dialogue and cooperation between those two states, and wanted international cooperation through free trade. What he wanted was really the advancement of market organizations serving as the important international glue that held all of these organizations together. So my question for you then is, what can we do to make markets more prominent in the international field. Now, we can find scholarship at Mises.org where there's scholarship like the about law of the seas, right? Where this is a lot of stuff that developed in terms of ships salvaging lost merchandise at sea, the salvage laws, the way that ships interact at sea in international waters. And a lot of this just grew out of private organizations. There was no clear international organization that imposed these laws. And in some sense, these were, of course, governed very much by market organizations, which had an interest in preserving the free movement of goods internationally. So the question is, how can we do that more often? How can we really advance the role of markets internationally in spite of all of this growth of power that's going on in these international organizations?
Well, I don't like to speculate about the future because the thing is you can often be wrong. Just from the limits of knowledge, I don't know how things would emerge spontaneously if state power were to be scaled back. I believe that private actors will make decisions that are in their interest, and that cooperation will happen, that arrangements will be made. I won't pretend to know how people would do this. You're right. Historically, that is what happened. And I trust that in the absence of state intervention, it would happen again. I don't know exactly what form it would take. I don't believe that you can make predictions like that. The world is simply too complicated, and the choice architecture is variable. And so I do, as you said, these arrangements grew organically, emerged over time. They would do so again. We do not need states to make rules governing interaction. It's the whole idea that, like, I was reading a book by this fellow who was sitting in on these EU regulators who were talking, and he said, I couldn't understand their mindset, which was, we need some regulations for this thing. And he said, well, why? And he said, well, because there aren't any. And he said, but why do we need them? And they were just like, they looked at him like he was an idiot or something, like, because there aren't any regulations. And he's like, but do we even need them? And they were just like, who is this guy? What does he not understand here? The desire to control and to make systems of coercion is it's a natural outgrowth of state power and the monopoly power that states have. And so when you remove that and you decentralize and you create a market mechanism for more competition and allow people the freedom to engage in the interactions that they want to, you will see better, lower friction interactions. So, I don't know what that would look like in the absence of state intervention, but I trust that it would occur.
All right. Well, I think that's. I think we've done our bit to bring some of these questions to the fore. I just feel that sometimes there's not enough discussion about this in our circles, libertarian circles, Austrian circles, to really take a look at these organizations, because when I get article submissions that say, right, we need better enforcement from the World Trade Organization, we need some mechanism by which we can impose free trade, or some mechanism by which we can impose a classical liberal or a libertarian sort of politics upon these nation states that we don't like. That just seems to be that's courting serious pain in the future, because you're creating organizations that can impose their will on a variety of people and organizations. And we've seen where that goes. It morphs into more powerful organizations that end up acting like states, even if they're not full-fledged states yet. And I do think it does. It could benefit from some more discussion, I think, in our circles, and to take a more critical look at these topics, at these organizations, right? And some of them I think people recognize are problematic, like the World Bank. That's so obviously corrupt, so obviously serves the elites, and so obviously is an organization that serves central banks, that I think most people in our circle see that's problematic. But I think other organizations like the UN, like the EU, a lot of times these are framed as organizations that are designed to serve liberal interests, that is, in the service of say, free markets and decentralization. But I'm not sure that the record really supports that idea. So have a look then at these two articles we're discussing. The first one by our guest, Joseph Solis-Mullen, is "We Can't Fix International Organizations Like the WTO, Abolish Them." That's from March 15th at Mises.org. And then this other article, this longer article, which has a lot of great summary information, so I do recommend reading it. It's called "Subsidiarity and Secession, Bringing the Austrian School to the 21st Century." That's by Marcos Falcone. You can find that online as well. And in fact, I'll link to it in the episode description. So thank you, Joseph, for joining me today. Thank you all out there for listening to Radio Rothbard. We'll be back next week with more, and we'll see you next time. One last thing, Radio Rothbard fans. Before you go, I want to make sure you know about our April 26 event in Phoenix, Arizona. And this one's called Our Enemy, the Bureaucracy. This one features Dr. Robert Malone, Tom Woods, and Tom DiLorenzo as they discuss the psychological operations and bureaucratic control, the madness of COVID-era public health, and the corruption and hypocrisy of our federal bureaucracy. Tickets are $100 for Mises members and $120 for non-members. You can register now at Mises.org/Phoenix25, and you have a chance to win a free ticket to the event if you enter the raffle at Mises.org/Phoenix Raffle 25 by April 1st.